So,
pretty much done.
I know. Also, another really good negative argument I've been thinking about, and I realized that I think it actually might be good. It might be good for the late tournament. It's also really good on the flow. It's the incarceration dissat, and what it says is that gun policies will be unevenly enforced, and the warrant is great on this because it says that because guns are so widespread, there must be selective enforcement, which means that we only enforce poor districts of poor African Americans. And this is going to cause violent racist discrimination, more stop and frisk policies, which are already proven to be racist. This is a huge mistake because we are already at a brink where we have too many people in prisons. This is going to cause even more mass incarceration. So, I don't know which file this thing's under, but the argument is pretty simple. So first of all, the link is that banning handguns results in uneven enforcement, and this will lead to mass incarceration because we will only be incarcerating the populations where we assume there are guns, and these are African American populations. As a result, we will see an increase of what is already going on in the status quo, which is an overflooding of African Americans in prison. Like 1 in 3 African Americans can expect to see the inside of a prison cell. Why is that? Because of uneven enforcement. This is only going to exacerbate it to a rate never before seen. And what this leads to is the mass incarceration is a form of political exclusion that makes upward mobility impossible. The impact I have for this in the Dropbox is that when we incarcerate one population, the fact of the matter is that even if they get out of jail, they will never cast a ballot again for the rest of their lives. So this serves as potent bias and makes it so that they are essentially disqualified from the political field. We can see this through the evidence, which talks about how it computes to be about a net loss of 50,000 residents in each major city. It has cost the Democrats many seats in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and has also overturned the 2000 presidential election race. So what this means is that, the logic here, or rather the fact, is that prisons, they accrue a ton of political influence. Ever since 1982, all the new penitentiaries have been built in mainly white states. So what happens is that African Americans are shipped from their home states to these white supremacist states where all the prison municipalities are built. And as a result, black electoral strength is diluted, while the people who are inside prisons fuel the electoral strength of white supremacists who then pass more punitive policies that cause more mass incarceration. The impact of this is, one, you're going to be causing rampant structural oppression, structural violence and oppression. And solving oppression is key to actually accessing morality, because oppression essentially excludes one race from the discussion of the morality table, which means that we never access normative truths as long as this knowledge remains subjugated and invisible to our eyes. And the second response is that this is incredibly immoral because you're going to make it so that racism can never get better. So before you pass the gun control laws, perhaps racism can get better, right? Because there's discourse about hate crimes, and there's the civil rights movement. It's an upward trend. But the second you pass the gun ban, it's going to be a never-ending cycle of racism, because as more African Americans are mass incarcerated, the white supremacists pass more policies that cause more mass incarceration and fuel the stereotype that all African Americans are evil and violent. And this is going to make a never-ending cycle of structural violence. And when you do weighing, you should tell the judge to prefer systemic impacts that are ongoing now over other impacts, because first of all, hundreds of thousands of African Americans are suffering every single day, and B is that even if their impact occurs, there's been so many years of your impact aggregating over and over again means that, so let's say 100,000 people affected each year. After 100 years, you have billions of people being affected already. So then after a certain time span, you're going to outweigh them either way, especially if they're running like extinction scenarios. You can be like, dude, by the time we reach this extinction scenario, my evidence will have outweighed yours by like 100 times already, because our disadvantages keep aggregating.
When you run the electoral thing, though, make sure to explain the link very clearly.
Exactly.
Because judges, like, for the most part, they'll understand it, but you need to emphasize the fact that, like, only a certain race gets disenfranchised, right? That, like, you give all the voting power to the whites. If you don't emphasize that, your link doesn't become clear. So you have to be very careful when doing that, because only then can you access your impacts. Make sure your judges understand it before you go for it in your last speech.
So the two best arguments on the neg in terms of strategy, I would say, are the black markets and incarceration. Because one gives you access to racism and one gives you access to increased crime. In this topic, I feel that the negative is already at an extreme disadvantage, so I have no more qualms with running a counterplan. So you don't phrase this as a counterplan, right? What I think people should do on the negative is frame it as an opportunity cost, because right now 80 million Americans own guns. Sure, we can have it given that a couple of thousand are criminals, but the other people who own guns are completely normal citizens who toiled and labored to own their own private property. We should not be allowed to strip them of this private property or the societal benefits that they see in their own subjective views can benefit them. So the advocacy should be that we should not be looking at a complete ban of handguns, because it's not about keeping all guns away from all people, it's about keeping certain people away from all guns. So we should take the 0.1% criminals and make it so that those people can never get guns. That way we can still access the societal benefits of these 79 million people who get to keep their guns and are not affected by the destruction of the Constitution. This competes on net benefits because first, my Rudolph evidence in the Dropbox says that Colorado essentially had a regulation and it dropped 40%. Now a lot of the app empirics can turn against them in terms of regulations because the affirmation likes to talk about DC, they like to talk about the EU, the UK, and they like to talk about Australia. And they like to say that these countries ban guns. But that's simply not true. Whenever they run any of these three pieces of evidence, you should turn it against them because these countries did not have bans. They had regulations. And regulations is completely different from the affirmative because you can't regulate something that's already banned. You need to say, look, all of your evidence points to the fact that regulations are good. That means that we should not ban guns, but rather we should have tighter regulations. So this is all negative ground. This is also distinctly better because it doesn't violate the Constitution. A total ban violates the Constitution because you hold that no one can privately own a handgun. But this regulation says that, sure, you can own a handgun as long as you're not a criminal. And as far as I'm concerned, that definitely doesn't violate the Constitution. And your weighing on this argument should be that even if they prove that there's going to be an increase in crime if we don't ban handguns, that's not enough for us to ban handguns. The Xiao 15 evidence I have explicitly says that the 79 million Americans who do own guns have their own societal benefits, and this should outweigh the minority of people who are being affected by gun violence. So this is when defensive arguments come in really handy, because if you can minimize their impacts to a minimum, you outweigh with these 79 million Americans who do deserve to have guns. And also, it turns all their case, because usually when they run crime, you're like, okay, criminals can't get guns. Or if they run like Mexican cartels, you're like, okay, terrorists can't get guns. We'll make it so that you need a purchasing license, a background check, all of these conditions, all outlined in the counterplan text. It's great. So in terms of negative strategy, actually no, let's first talk about answers to incarceration. Because although I agree that not many people run incarceration, both I and I gave Eric the DISAD too, ran incarceration at NatQual, so I'm sure people have it prepped out and some people will be running it. So when you hit incarceration, the best responses you can have is, first of all, just because there's incarceration, I think the best argument to incarceration is just because policies are bad now is not a reason to abandon the policy. It's just a reason to change the policy. So say, instead of completely abandoning the system of our government, we should just be more towards amending the system. That's what the entire civil rights movement was about, right? It was about amending the system, not completely abandoning it. So just spout a bunch of stuff about how we're going to crack down on police brutality and create discourse, eliminate racism in police academies. There are plenty of programs doing that right now, but just say we're going to increase this and we're going to get rid of the incarceration. I think that's a great argument on the lay. And the second response to incarceration is, let's see. Just because there will be incarceration is not a reason to ban something. Under your mindset about incarceration, we would never ban anything, right? We would never ban drugs, we would never ban murder. If we ban murder, there's going to be selective enforcement because people are looking for murder in poor minorities. That's a terrible, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? We still need to ban things even though there's mass incarceration. We can only hope that at one point people realize that mass incarceration is bad and that they don't want to commit crimes anymore. And this is the only way to actually solve the crime long term. We can't just say, we don't want people going to jail, so we don't pass policies, right? And that's a good argument. And also, another really good argument is that if you do have defensive arguments on incarceration, you should try to outweigh. Because the fact of the matter is that African Americans are 4 times more likely to be killed by handguns than other races. And the reason for this is, of course, hate crimes. So you can say, at the final, you can say, okay, in terms of weighing, sure, there might be a little higher incarceration for African Americans, but this is going to be completely offset by the fact that we're preventing hate crimes from occurring, which in turn also deconstructs racism because people have lesser avenues to act out their prejudice towards this community. So you have to do some weighing. You can say like, look, like 200,000 African Americans are dying each year because of hate crimes. I'm not sure if that's right, someone fact check that. Maybe you're going to increase incarceration by 1%. That's fine if we can have the goal of deconstructing racism and stopping the needless deaths of these community members. And also, like, polls show that African Americans are very in favor of a handgun ban. Like, they were very in favor of the DC and Chicago handgun ban. So there's plenty of support in that community as well. Also, I don't think I really talked about how to respond to black markets. I just said that it was a really good argument, but there are indeed good responses to black market that I know. So the first response to black market is that this mindset of never banning anything because of a black market is regressive and leads to paralysis. So what this means is it's kind of the same argument I talked about incarceration. You can't say, oh, we cannot ban this because there will be a black market. Literally banning anything will lead to a black market. So under your mindset, there would just be paralysis and we would never ban anything for fear of a black market. The second response is that black markets itself is evidentiary proof that handguns are being decreased and that it is harder to get them because it's very hard to access the black market. There's tons of security surveillance, and to even access the black market, the people who operate the black market need to trust you, and that is like extremely hard. Like, you can't just say, oh, black market means anyone can get guns. No, like, I have an easier time operating on the legal system than the black market. The third response is that black markets are completely non-unique because our current legal system is basically a black market. Anyone can get handguns. I could literally go online right now, make up a birthday, and buy a handgun for 50 cents. So nothing can be worse than the status quo right now because guns are already proliferating so much. And the fourth response is that the La Follette evidence is really good to preempt black markets. It says that, look, black markets are not drugs. You cannot grow handguns in your backyard. So black market manufacturers for guns are comparatively different because what is happening is that they are taking guns from the primary market to fuel the secondary market. So if you collapse the primary market, if anything, the circulation of guns is going to drastically decrease and make it even harder for guns to survive in the secondary market, i.e. the black market. And the fifth response is that, oh yeah, it's going to be like a simple supply and demand economics factor. It says that after we ban handguns, the supply will indeed drop to levels that are never before seen, which means that since supply is still high and demand is so low, the amount you would take to purchase a handgun is so expensive that after a certain point of the price continuing to increase linear, there will be no one will be able to afford these handguns anyway. So it's self-defeating. And
so how do you counter, like, if they bring up like individual city examples of handgun bans and black markets, how do you counter that? Like Eric Dang divided Chicago.
Oh yes, Eric Dang likes to run my Chicago empiric. So the Chicago empiric is that after a handgun ban, there was a black market, right? So your response to this is, okay, sure, there was a black market, right? But the fact of the matter is that before the handgun ban, it was just as easy to get guns in Chicago. Which means that, if anything, we helped Chicago by banning guns. Like, Chicago, if you look at the statistics, Chicago's violence has actually decreased. So, yes, there is a black market, but the evidence kind of hypes up this black market. It's not like anyone can get these guns, right? Because crime is going down. So, I agree, like, if you're on neg, if you're on app, you're like, I agree, banning handguns will make a black market. But no one in their right sense is going to say it's easier to get guns from the black market than it is to get guns on the legal market.
Yeah, the argument is about like accessibility, right?
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, the point of reducing guns is violence. So if Chicago is the example they bring up, and violence went down, even though a black market arose, the clear consequential effect is that handgun bans are good because they decrease violence, right? So even if black markets come up, it's an issue of reduced accessibility, right? You can ban handguns, right? And that doesn't assume that the solvency is the fact that you have zero guns. It's the fact that you have less guns in the world where we don't ban handguns.
And the sixth response to the black market, I just thought right now, I think it's also that it's kind of non-unique, right? Because neither the AF nor the NEG can solve for terrorism or like the hardcore criminals that really want guns. If they want guns, they're going to be able to get guns whether there's a handgun ban or not, which means that passing a handgun ban doesn't affect them, but not passing it will affect them. So, like, completely like non-unique, right? And then the seventh response is that, let me see, what would the seventh response? Oh yeah, the seventh response is that criminals are all using illegal guns anyway. So it's also another non-unique argument because like no one in their right mind is going to use legal guns to commit crimes, right? Like they can just trace that, like, oh, who purchased this, purchasing license. They find out who you are. The fact of the matter is that all the homicides and terrorist activities are being committed with illegal guns anyway, which means that like, okay, sure, banning handguns will lead to a black market. So what? These people are already using illegal guns anyway. There's going to be no shift because this is just their daily life anyway. There's no shift to the black market. Equally, you can use this argument on your side as the neg, and you can say banning handguns doesn't solve criminals because all the criminals are using illegal guns anyway. But that's kind of a weaker argument on the negative side. So let's talk about like general responses, right? Another really common response of the neg is that people like to run constitutionality. So first of all, the first response to constitutionality is that you should attack the framework of the Constitution because the Constitution is ever changing, it has upheld racist policies, it has upheld the discrimination of women. You have to call into question that the Constitution is not always right, and the fact that the Constitution is always changing because of our subjective interpretation of the Constitution means that it is not a guide to it is not an accurate guide to moral action. Because moral action needs to literally be like a straight, very simple answer about what we should do in every case. You can't have like this wonky constitution that is like, oh, between these years and these years we should do this, but then between these years and these years the morality changes and we should do this. Like that's a terrible guide to moral action. Like what if morality changes in like the next 2 years? And then the second response to constitutionality should be that like you want to devolve the Constitution framework to a weighing argument. So you want to be saying things like societal welfare definitely outweighs constitutionality. We literally violate the First Amendment every single day, right? Like you cannot walk into a crowded theater and shout fire. And although this impedes on your ability of free speech, you're still not allowed to do this because societal welfare acts as a trump to constitutionality.
Trump! Actually, the argument is about how there are restrictions permitted in the Constitution if it's an issue about, as you said, societal welfare, right? It also applies to when people talk about autonomy, right? Obviously, no right is totally absolute or right, or like it triumphs everything, right? The accessibility to the right is hindered when you violate the rights of others, i.e., the right to bear arms, right, would be restricted in the sense that if those rights were used to hurt others and take away the other securities of others, right, that's a case in where constitutional rights would not be violated, but they would be permitted, like, so it would be like morally permissible to triumph for the sake of societal welfare.
And the third response on constitutionality should be more on a different layer, that the interpretation of the Constitution can be ever-changing, and that's bad. For example, the most common and perhaps only study that people cite is the Heller versus Chicago, right? But you have to understand that this Supreme Court case was a 5-4 decision, which means that, sure, 5 Supreme Court justices agree that this is a personal right, but then 4 others would definitely beg to differ, which proves that this is not an absolute moral framework because there is like personal interpretation and subjective interpretation of what it means. So in a sense, there is this one court justice called Justice Breyer who writes that Judge Scalia's decision to essentially have handgun bans unconstitutional was a misinterpretation of the Constitution. So in this way, this acts on a different layer because even if they win that constitutionality is good, you can see that you can just say that Justice Scalia's interpretation of the Constitution was bad and was completely misinterpreted. So, let's see, so yeah, in terms of negative strats, you should go straight for black markets. If that's not an avenue that you can go for your armed civilians argument and also your incarceration disad, which will probably be your biggest impact because you'll be able to weigh oppression. And then, if time permits, you should also go for your on-case turns because you should definitely be making turns on domestic violence, which people are running, and you should be making turns on his soft power and crime arguments. Like, for his crime argument, another argument is that, look, banning handguns doesn't decrease crime because everyone's using illegal guns anyway. There's evidence that says that only 1% of guns are actually legally like purchased. So, yeah, that will work in your favor. Oh, and then also on the neg, you have to remember your counterplan opportunity cost because At the end of the day, if you win that regulations are better than a total ban, you will win the debate, because there's no reason we should ban something, cause a black market and mass incarceration when we can just regulate it. So, yeah, you guys should be set for state quals, easy qual state after that. Very good.
Thank you, Anthony Ma.
No problem, Nathan.
Actually, how did you enjoy the lecture?
Actually, son, how would you rank that lecture? On a scale of 1 through 10?
Seriously. No idea.
Oh,
Anthony! Just kidding.
It's 2 up.
Hey, Anthony, how you doing?
I'm alright.
You know what you're
Hey, Ashley's son.
Hi.
How you doing?